Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I'm very excited to be hosting two friends, two great analysts of China, two great journalists, Ed Wong and Amy Qin, both of the New York Times. We're here to discuss Ed's new book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, which was just published by Viking Press. As expected, one of the best books I've read about China, a book that not only illuminates present China, but is a fascinating exploration of China's recent history and of Ed's own family's journey from China to the United States. Ed is, as everyone knows, a diplomatic correspondent with the New York Times, taking a few hours off from a very busy schedule. We're recording this here right at the start of the NATO summit. And Amy, who is a national correspondent with the New York Times covering Asian American communities. Both Amy and Ed were based in China. Ed was the bureau chief before moving back here to the United States, and Amy was in Beijing for a better part of a decade before moving to Taiwan. So we're going to talk about Ed's book. We're going to have Amy weigh in on Ed's book, but we're going to take advantage of having two of the best analysts of contemporary China and U.S.-China relations here to talk about their views on the reporting environment in China, U.S.-China relations. So, Amy, Ed, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jude. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Jude.
Ed, congratulations. Again, a fantastic book, a very rich book, a very personal book. I wanted to ask you, we'll get into a bit of what the book was about, how you wrote this, but I first wanted to ask you how this came about. You have had a busy day job covering U.S.-China relations at the time, domestic China. You moved back here to the United States. How did you get the idea for this?
Well, in some ways, I've been writing the book in my head for a lot of my adult life. I started getting interested in China in my 20s. When I went to grad school, I'd studied Chinese in Beijing briefly. I kept up the Mandarin studies at Berkeley and was taking courses in Chinese history and politics. And at that time, I decided I would probe deeper into my parents' own background in China because I was interested in how my own family history had intersected with Chinese politics and the great events of the 20th century in China. So I started asking my parents more about their histories in China. And it was at that time that I discovered my father had been a member of the People's Liberation Army in the 1950s, back when it was the initial force that Mao was deploying around different parts of China under his control. At that time, the communists had just won the Civil War, as you know, and the PLA was involved in the Korean War. They were trying to hold off the American forces on the Korean Peninsula, and so my father decided he wanted to join the PLA and fight the Americans in that war. So then I probed a bit, found out that he was stationed in Xinjiang for some years. And then I made a student film at Berkeley that had some of the rough outlines of that, but on a more superficial level. I don't think I could have written this book without having lived and reported in China for a long spell, because being there in China, traveling to places where my father had been, whether that was in Manchuria in the northwest, in Beijing, in Guangdong province where his home village is, and Hong Kong where he was born, and also, of course, in Xinjiang where he spent his army years, that all gave me a lot more context for what was happening in China both today as well as decades ago. And so when I returned to Washington in 2018 to be a diplomatic correspondent here, I then could engage in these very personal and deep conversations with my father and with my mother, as well as other family members, about that period in Chinese history when Mao first took power and what my father was doing out there in these various parts of China as a member of the PLA.
I wonder if I could start a two-part question. One is the title of this. So I guess it's a two-part question, the title and then the subtitle. And in particular, I'm curious about where and why the choice of Edge of Empire came from. And the second is I'm curious about the word reckoning in the subtitle, but maybe take the first one, Edge of Empire.
Yeah. I mean, I think that in some in some context, the word empire is controversial these days. We use it, and some people use it in a very critical manner to protest what they call imperial actions by superpowers or hegemonic powers. I use it in a more matter-of-fact term. I think that the U.S. has been an empire for much of its existence, especially since the 19th century and definitely in the 20th century. I feel that China itself, under the communists, is an empire because it has reconstituted the territory of the Qing Empire, is holding on to much of that by force. And what I mean by force, it starts in the 1950s with military occupations in places like Xinjiang, Tibet, which my father was part of. And we see these days that China, at least in its territorial ambitions in Asia, is getting bolder. We see it pushing on various fronts, whether it's in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Himalayan frontier. And I also think that when we look at the geopolitical aspect of China, we often look at, things like Belt and Road or its economic ties and these actions in the waterways around China. But I also think that if you were to look honestly at the geopolitics of China, a lot of it concerns these Western regions, these vast Western regions where China is using an immense amount of force to hold on to its territory. And these areas constitute about a third of China. They're not a small part of China, even though the majority of the Chinese population is in central and eastern China. But if China were to lose control of these parts of its territory, then it would demonstrably not be nearly the country that it is, whether in size or in, I think, its psychic outlook on the world. I think it sees itself as a great power in part because it is this reconstituted neo-Qing empire in a way. The nationalists tried to do the same thing. It's not just a communist ambition, but the nationalists failed to do that.
And then talk about the word reckoning.
Well, reckoning it's interesting because my father, when I was showing him the book or a draft of the book and he saw the subtitle, he said, "Oh, is reckoning what does that mean in your context of this book?" And I would say the way I would describe it, it's how family members and I have assessed China throughout the decades, are grappling with both where China has been and where it's going, are grappling with the current politics and policies of China. My father's own struggles when he was young and a member of the army, and then right after the army with the party and its own internal contradictions. And I think we're all kind of grappling with that. I think everyone at this table is. I think many Americans are. We're all in our own reckonings of China. I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that I see reckoning as, in some ways, a neutral term in which we're trying to assess China, its direction, and our own relationships with it.
This was obviously a deeply personal book, but also a deeply researched book. This in and of itself, this is a fascinating history of modern China. Of course, using your father as the vehicle to tell this story. I'm curious just how you did the book, how you wrote the book. Also, a question I think many of us who have written or try to write books is how do you do this having a full-time job? But just talk a bit about how this came together.
Right. The book has a structure that I had to think through very carefully, and I did that when I was writing the book proposal more than 6 years ago. And obviously, there's two timelines in the book. There's the timeline of my father from actually starting in the 1940s with the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, going through the Civil War in China to Mao's victory, and then my father's time in the army, and then finally to his flight from Hong Kong in 1962, and then to America. And so, there's that timeline, and then there's the chapters on contemporary China, which are largely set from 2008 onward, when I moved to Beijing to report for the Times, although the second chapter is set in Hong Kong in 1997 during the British handover of Hong Kong. And so the trick was to how to both structure the book to make it coherent given all these different chronologies, and also to do the research into all these different parts of China. And so on the first question, I decided that I would have my father's story be chronological. So the book starts off in 1941, December, when the Japanese invaded Hong Kong, and then proceeds chronologically through my father's story up until his move to the United States, and then all the way up to 2023 when we had recent conversations on the future of China. In between those chapters, I then put in chapters that had material from my reporting on China that were relevant to each section of my father's journey, but set in the present day. So for example, when I talk about Hong Kong's a British colony and how the Japanese invasion changed all that, then the next chapter is Hong Kong 1997, when we go into the British handover to China. And Hong Kong's an important element in the book, not only because my family is from there, but because it was the meeting point of empires, both, obviously China, Britain, and then Japan when it invades Hong Kong. So it's this important nexus, I think, of how imperial powers have interacted with each other. That happens in other parts of China, but Hong Kong provides a personal focal point for that. And I think for us today, we look at Hong Kong as this very important symbol of both the transition from older empires, Britain, to newer ones, China, and also what the Communist Party has decided to do with a bastion of what we would consider liberal values or rule of law within its territory. So I think Hong Kong holds important value because of that, and is important in the book as a storytelling point too. So all those alternate. There's a big section of the book that's focused on the Western regions, on Xinjiang because my father was stationed there, but Xinjiang today, and on the policies that the party has imposed to try and maintain control of mainly the Uyghur Muslims out there and the Kazakh Muslims. For that, I relied on a lot of my firsthand reporting, but also the reporting of many of my colleagues, including Amy, who did many deeply researched stories, for example, on the sterilization policy that the communists were imposing on Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And then some of the final chapters are on Hong Kong in 2019 as the protests are gaining momentum, which Amy also reported on. And then the sort of climax of those protests when I was there, which was the siege of university campuses in November of 2019. And then U.S.-China relations, because I went back with Secretary Blinken to China in June of 2023, when I think U.S.-China relations were at an all-time low, as you know, Jude, and U.S. officials were afraid that it would all go off a cliff. So I think that a lot of it is doing these chapters where I interviewed my father at length, as well as family members, and also looked up historical research on Chinese policies back in that era. And then a lot of the contemporary chapters are based on my own reporting, and mainly it had to be a lot of firsthand reporting in these areas.
I just have to say, I feel like I have some window into your relationship with your father by the fact that you capitalize father all throughout the book.
Right.
Because as I read that, I thought, what would I write? And I think I would have written my dad, lowercase d. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that says a lot more about me and my relationship with my dad or you with yours. I'm curious that choice you made.
Well, what's funny is if you look at the dedication, it says to mom and dad. So I do call dad like it. But when I made a conscious decision to use father with a capital F, as you say, and not my father or my dad, because I wanted that word to be the word of a character in the book. And I wanted father because I felt I needed distance between, I didn't envision this person I was writing about as the dad that I knew growing up in Alexandria, Virginia, but rather this other figure that had gone through this entire life experience that I was only discovering now. And I felt that having father created that other person that I could then write about with some detachment.
And would have using his name felt dishonest because
Yeah,
he's your father?
Right. It would felt a little bit artificial. I just felt it was easier to say father, and also then it would remind the reader that the author had this relationship with this person that they're writing about. And also, I think, and this is something I think that we all know about, is that in Chinese, everything is like a 2-syllable thing. Like it's rare to use. It feels awkward to call someone by one syllable. So like saying dad throughout the book would have felt a little bit weird in the context of China for me. As we know, Chinese call their fathers like Baba, and everything in Chinese, they try and do this symmetrical 2 or 4 syllable phrasing. And so I felt father felt more honest and consistent with the way it would be rendered in Chinese, for example.
I want to turn to Amy in a minute, but let me just ask you how your father made sense of the twisting turns of the revolution in China, someone who made an early decision to devote themselves to what they thought the revolution was, as it took on a different direction or shape as Mao twisted it, distorted it, or took it in its true revolutionary endpoint, depending on how you look at Leninist revolutions. How did your father make sense of this?
When my father looks back on it now, I mean, he still feels that the choice he made at the beginning of the 1950s was the right one. It felt like it was, in a way, he feels it was the inevitable one, because it was the same one that many Chinese citizens made, and because of the success of the revolution, what he felt was the corruption and the misgovernance of the nationalists before that, as well as the war on the Korean Peninsula that was going on, that it felt like the logical decision to make, both logical and emotional decision to make, and that many people who were young at the time made the same decision and probably would not have done anything differently. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a family gathering here in the DC area where I was passing out copies of the book to the family, and my father stood up and he said, you know, the choice I made was the same one that many Americans have made, which is, and he likened it to the World War II era when we had these posters of Uncle Sam calling on mostly young Americans to join the war effort. And he said, that's essentially what I was doing. I was answering this call for my country. But I think as time went on, and this is what the book unveils, the internal contradictions in what the communists were trying to do in China, their logic of power, and specifically of sort of like power within a Leninist organization, I think, made him disillusioned. And then, of course, Mao's horrific choices of policy, including the Great Leap Forward, which led to the Great Famine that killed anywhere from 30 to 40 million people, as historians estimate. I think those then made my father very disillusioned about the direction of China, about Mao's leadership, about his continuing hold on power, and then he made the decision in the early 60s to flee China.
You know, final question on this. I'm curious your father's thoughts on China today.
He has an interesting take on China. I mean, I think this is an important point that I wanted to make in the book, that a lot of Chinese feel very patriotic about China, even if they become disillusioned with what either local officials are doing or the central leadership is doing. They still maintain this strong faith in China and in the potential for it to better itself. I think he feels that way today. He still holds out hope that party leadership can lead to a better China at some point. I don't think he feels that way at the current moment, because I think he has seen some of the policies that Xi Jinping has carried out and is skeptical of them, and is also very skeptical of the fact that Xi has held on to power beyond the 10-year norm that seems to have been set sometime in the post-Deng era. I think he experienced the corruption of power under Mao, and he feels that could happen under Xi, and he is very cautious right now about the future of China, and somewhat skeptical. So, but at the same time, he feels a sense of faith in the motherland. I think that's hard. I think a lot of Chinese feel that way. Chinese Americans, Chinese in the diaspora and in other countries, and certainly Chinese citizens feel that way. So I think that one of the miscalculations I think that some people here in Washington make, whether it's officials or analysts, is that, there could be a scenario under which there's some mass rebellion against Chinese leadership. I think even if there's disillusionment with certain policies, that people still feel wedded to the idea that there's some potential leadership out there that will lead China to a better place. And they also want China to be a strong power. They don't want it to be a weak power. And I think that this is a very tricky thing for American policymakers to grapple with, because I think that certain policy decisions that they make could then set Chinese citizens off against America, because Chinese citizens are very proud of their country and they want their country to be at least on par with America. That's something that a lot of American officials don't want to see, because there are certain parts of that are incompatible with the American desire for control or dominance in certain areas of the world, whether it's in trade, in economic rules and norms, or in military power in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah. Amy, you a lot of angles through which you could comment on Ed's book as a friend, as a colleague, as a former reporter in China, as someone who is, I'm sure, talking with many people like Ed's father, Chinese Americans. Just your thoughts on the book and anything that struck you in one of these many identities from which you could offer comments.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I thought I was so impressed with the book, Ed, just through reading it. You were talking about juggling all that. You have an extremely demanding job. You are a father of a young child. We co-teach a class, and you've been able to put together this incredible, deeply reported, and very thoughtful and poignant personal book that I loved reading it. I also think that what I love about this book is that it is really at once, it feels like an American story, it feels like a Chinese story, and it feels like a Chinese American story. Like it really sort of captures, I think, something that I see so much now in my own beat covering Asian American communities, which is just that, I think oftentimes the way that immigration is discussed in this country is that people come here and they're almost like blank slates. We see through Ed's book that that's very much not the case. Your father had this incredibly rich and complex experience in life before he came here, and it wasn't also static after he came here. He went back to China several times. His thoughts about what had happened had changed over the time as well, and I feel like it really helps us understand more, how people who are first-generation immigrants who come to the U.S., how they sort of become Americans, but also still inhabit, how those previous experiences still inform their lives here. So I really, really love to see that. I thought it was like the ultimate Chinese American sort of root-seeking book. A lot. You kind of mentioned it in your book that so many people who have gone back to China. You said that you didn't grow up hearing many of these stories, right? And this is stuff that you uncovered mostly recently. And so I think that's an experience that many Chinese American and Asian American and children of immigrants can relate to. It's this idea that your parents don't really want to talk about the past, the hardship. They really are here in America to focus on the future, and you really have to dig it out of them. And so I thought that for you to be able to go back to China, as many Chinese Americans have done, to visit the places where your father grew up and where your family had spent time, but then also to be able to speak with the policymakers and the other, people who were sort of involved in like the larger kind of context at the time. And also while you were there, that's like the ultimate root-seeking experience.
Right. Yeah, which you probably have gone through yourself, Amy. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your own experiences with that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, this is such a personal book in many ways, and it's coming, as you mentioned, at this time of, I think U.S.-China tensions, which we'll discuss more later. It also comes at a time where I feel like you both know this more about the discussion in D.C., where there's probably some misunderstandings about the Chinese Communist Party and people's relationships to it. How did it feel to be introducing this book and your own family as a very personal story, which I'm sure it's daunting for anyone writing a memoir, right, to be so vulnerable in public. But how did it feel for you to be bringing this book into the world at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't sure how my family, especially my wider family, would react to it. But in the late stages of the book, a couple people read through many of the chapters or drafts of it, people in my family, including a cousin, a daughter of my Uncle Sam, who's a major character in the book. And they felt that they learned a lot from the book, and they didn't have strong criticisms or disapprovals of things I was airing in the book. So I think that that gave me confidence that once it came out, then my family would react positively to it. My father and Sam, who provided a lot of the information about the past, they read through drafts of those chapters in which they were prominent figures. They, corrected factual errors I had in early drafts. But overall, they agreed with the framing of the chapters and the way I contextualized their experiences in the book. And I was wondering whether my father would be uneasy with, my description of the narrative arc of his time in China itself and the disillusionment and disappointment he ultimately felt. But I think because, he's 92 now this month, and I think because of that distance from those events, then he didn't have any compunctions about talking about those or revealing those or having me reveal those to the public. I think some of the things he himself grapples with are the more contemporary turns that China's taken. For example, I write a lot in the book about some of the ethnic tensions that have occurred in Xinjiang and Tibet, and he wonders today why things have become so dark out there in the West, why there's so much violence. And I don't think he's aware of, the evolution of communist policies towards those regions. I also think that when he thinks back to his time there, there's a somewhat of a sheen of nostalgia to some of his experiences in the West, and he compartmentalizes some of the darker aspects of the military occupation that he was part of. And when I was researching the book, my uncle presented to me a few letters that my father had written to him several years after he left Xinjiang. And my father was in mainland China, wrote a letter to Uncle Sam, then wrote some from Hong Kong once he got there. And in one of the letters, it was interesting, I found a passage in there where he said, we arrived in Xinjiang. He was talking about his travels out to the West and his posting out there. He said, we arrived out there in late 51 to early 52. And what I discovered was Xinjiang was this melting pot of different ethnicities, 15 or so ethnic groups is what he says. And he said they were all very different, very diverse, different languages, different cultures, but they had one thing in common, which was an intense hatred of the Han people. And he said that this was because of the rule by warlords and by nationalist commanders that had taken place in the area shortly before the PLA had arrived. So he attributes it to misgovernance by ethnic Han warlords, generals, and commanders. But when we were doing interviews for this book, when I was talking to him, he never talked about that discovery that he had made when he first went out to Xinjiang. And as I said, he still talks with some, surprise about how tense things are there in these areas right now in contemporary China. But I think if he had looked back on those letters, if he had dug in deeper into his memories, he would remember the roots of some of the tensions that we see today.
It just made me think of this, that as reporters, but you're someone who just did this book of pretty thorough research, what was the most exciting thing that you found? Was there like a letter that you discovered, some sort of archival document, some conversation you had?
I had some very deep conversations with my father during this period. I think in my 20s, as I was saying, a lot of this book has been written in my head in stages over many years. But in my 20s, when I was working on the student project in Berkeley, that was when my father first pulled out these photographs of himself in the Army. There's two existing photographs. He only pulled out one at the time, which is the one on the cover of the book. where you can't see it, but my father's wearing a cap, a PLA cap in that photo, and there's a blank spot where the red star would have been because it was a photograph that he had taken out in Xinjiang in 1953 when he was 21 years old. He had it taken in Photoshop, and then he eventually manages to mail it to his parents in Hong Kong. And when his father saw the photo, he had the red star rubbed out because he was afraid, if British authorities saw this, then it would cast, a pallor over the family in Hong Kong. So so that was like finding these old photos or having my father share them with me was fascinating for me. And then these letters that he had written Sam, because then they gave this unvarnished look at his immediate thoughts, both right after he left Xinjiang. One of the letters was in the late 1950s, before the Great Famine happened, but when he was starting a university course in Xi'an, where he wanted to be an aerospace engineer. He had just left the military, and he's exhorting his older brother to come back to China because he says, "Oh, you've been there in America many years now." His brother Sam went to study in America. "You've been there in America many years now. It's time to come back to China now to help build the new China. Like, if you are true to your Chinese roots, then you'll come back and do this." And I thought that was fascinating because it was, it's hard to tell at the time, how honest my father was about it, because he knew that officials were probably reading the letter. So he had to obviously be enthusiastic about the future of China. But I do think he meant it at the time, because when he was entering university in Xi'an, he still had these hopes that he would become a party member. He felt he had done his part for the military by serving in Xinjiang. And he still thought that Mao's industrial policies would put China on par with Britain and America. And he says that in the letter. He says, these policies that we're undertaking now, you should come and really witness the fruits of these. Like, you'll see this, for example, this bridge across the Yangtze River at Wuhan, where we can now travel across the Yangtze, and there's this railroad that's been built from the south to the north. So now it's funny, because when I think about the way we frame contemporary China, we often talk about infrastructure projects and how they're emblematic of sort of China's growth. But even then, in this letter in 1958, my father was like raving about the industrial policies and the infrastructure building that was taking place in China, saying this is a great symbol of China's advancement. And so he really wanted his brother to come back. But then 4 years later, after he gets to Hong Kong, he writes a series of letters that talks about his disillusionment. So these letters, I thought, were very important contemporary documents of what was happening in my father's head.
It's something that will challenge people writing biographies 20, 30 years from now. Email is not as expressive a form of communication of how people are thinking.
Right.
So it's just going to be sort of 3-sentence snippet emails with emojis.
Yeah.
That'll be a lot tougher to piece together how people have been, processing issues.
I should say that also, like, my reading of handwritten Chinese isn't great, so I had to. So a very generous and thoughtful professor, Eileen Cheng-Ying Chow, volunteered to help translate the letters, and her translations are incredible. They're very lyrical, and they capture some of the poetry and the angst that my father was experiencing in these letters.
I have a diary I bought at one of the junk markets in Beijing from 1964 that, try as I might and pretending that I'm work on China and know something about China, I've never been able to read it, and I've thought one of these days I should go get it translated. It could be nothing,
right?
Or it could be
it could be your next book, Jude.
It could be your next book.
Right. Oh, and speaking of research, I want to just give a shout out to you, Jude, because as I was researching different parts of the book, your book on sort of the new leftist ideology in China and the support that many of these leftists had for Xi Jinping was important for a chapter that I was writing on Xi and on the new forms of nationalism that we're seeing arising in China today.
I appreciate that. And of course, it's something I have to admit I do, is when people have books come out on China, I do sneak through the bibliography and see if I get a mention.
Right.
I'm not proud of it, but Amy, I wonder if I can pick up on a thread that we had just been discussing of how your discussions with Chinese Americans, they're processing U.S.-China relations. In some sense, when you're in Washington, you can come to think that the entirety of the bilateral relationship is determined here. But in a strict sense, almost the entirety of the bilateral relationship happens outside of DC, the economic relationship, the cultural relationship, the educational relationship. I just don't think we have a good sense here of how it's being interpreted and processed and the pressures this is putting on Chinese Americans. And this is now literally, your beat is looking at how Asian American communities in the United States. So just what strikes you about how the conversations you're having with the people like Ed's dad, what does that tell us about the relationship and the complexities for Chinese Americans? I know it's far too broad to, there's not one Chinese American response to this, but if just a snippet of the conversations you've been having.
And let me jump in just with the one additional question. Is I'm curious whether you find that there are very divergent viewpoints between, say, an older generation, like our parents' generation, and then the more recent immigrants or younger immigrants to the U.S. from China, for example.
God, that's a big question.
What's the spectrum of views you hear? I guess it's too unfair to ask.
Well, I mean, I've covered a few different stories related to Chinese Americans in the time that I've been here, and a lot of them have been about Chinese American communities that have been impacted by various national security policies or policies that are said to be carried out in the name of national security here in the U.S. So, for example, the impact on the Chinese American scientist community by the China Initiative. Also, more recently, the impact of various laws that are being passed at the state level, and also, I think, at the federal level, restricting in various ways Chinese citizens from buying property, including residential property. And yeah, what I'm hearing from Chinese Americans there, I think, is just this sort of bewilderment. Many of these people came here and thought that if I just keep my head down and I keep my head out of politics, I will just be able to sort of make a good life, make some money, buy a house, buy another house maybe for real estate investment, send my kids to a good school, and that's it. And now they're sort of being dragged into politics in a way that they weren't expecting. And many people have very sort of negative views of just politics generally, just because of their own family's experiences of politics in China. And so, what I'm hearing from people is that some people are being sort of mobilized into action about this. I mean, when you affect a Chinese citizen's ability to buy real estate here, I mean, that sort of gets at the heart of, that's a big issue. In China, you can't even really own outright a piece of property. That's sort of one of the promises of the U.S. is to be able to buy a house, right? And so I am starting to see people kind of, I don't know if that I haven't heard as much sort of reflection about the changes that are happening in China. I think people generally, and how that's impacting their ability to do that here. I think on a broader level, people sort of understand it. I do find that that there is, because many people haven't spent a lot of time in China recently or are not as familiar or following, New York Times coverage of what's happening in China, they don't know some of the problems that have been happening there in terms of, the threat crackdown on individual liberties and things, the reasons why the U.S. government is trying to roll out these policies. And, I'm consistently sort of astounded when I see the number of people who still continue organizing on WeChat, which, as we all know, is sort of a very kind of vulnerable app in terms of security. And so I do see that. I do also now see people wanting to get involved in the process, people sort of learning more about Asian American history. Previously that's maybe not something that they would have known about or learned about in China, but now they see that what their experience is being sort of in line with this experience of Chinese that came before them in America, all the way, dating back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so they're starting to see themselves as part of a sort of broader community here as well. And that's been really interesting. I do think that there is a bit of a generational difference where you do have sort of people who came in like the 60s and 70s and 80s who mostly came for education, and more recently you've had people come for other reasons, including family reunification or just, because they've had their parents made a bunch of money in the U.S. In China and were able to send them to schools here in the U.S. And so and they've spent less time in the U.S. And so they haven't really had as much time to sort of
yeah, they just haven't seen the U.S. in the same way that I think that they're the older generation has,
Right.
and at a time that was less divisive, at a time where U.S.-China relations were not as tense.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is when I look back at my family history and document some of the times or periods that my family spent in the U.S. when they first came here. So, for example, my uncle Sam Wong, came here to the U.S. Around 1948, and was here when the Korean War started. So he was here studying on a government scholarship, and then he eventually works for the U.S. military, for the Army first, and then for the Navy as an engineer. When the U.S. military is clearly fighting against Chinese forces on the Korean Peninsula. So even at moments of very heightened tension, I feel, between the China and the U.S., there are still many Chinese who are very willing to lash their fortunes to that of the U.S. And I said earlier that Chinese are very patriotic, but that doesn't mean that their loyalties are to the Chinese government. They might feel this affinity for the motherland, but they can also feel intense loyalty to their adopted country, to the U.S., as we all know. And so my father, when he came to the U.S., he had chosen a new land to build his fortunes and his family. And he was, like I think some of the immigrants you're describing, he wanted to have nothing to do with politics because he already been through this very turbulent and personally traumatic experience in the PRC. And I think he felt that politics is what leads our lives down these like paths of darkness. And so he has not been that interested in politics or in geopolitical, contemporary geopolitics, which is kind of ironic since that's what I report on. But he still remains deeply interested in Communist Party history and Chinese history, in like looking at the past. But he has never been that interested in politics in the U.S. I think in some ways he's emblematic of these immigrants you're talking about, Amy, that come here. They're trying to leave something behind. They realize, and in the home country, politics can be a very poisonous thing, as we know, and they don't want to have any part of that world. And yet now in the current period with U.S.-China tensions, then they're forced to have to think about that.
We've got about 15 minutes left. So I wanted to switch gears a bit. And first is to get the assessment of both of you about the reporting environment now in China and the challenges. You know, Amy, I know you were disinvited from remaining in China in 2020. Mm-hmm. It's just the middle of COVID. And you left.
I left at the end of 2016.
2016.
And I haven't had any problem going back. I mean, I went back in 2019. They granted me a visa to go report on the military parade that she held in 2019. And then I went back last year on a very short-term visa with Secretary Blinken and other journalists to cover that diplomatic trip.
At a high level, either speaking from the perspective of how the Times is thinking about this or just as journalists previously based in China in general, what's your sense on how much we're losing by not having, the cadre of journalists that we had 10 or 15 years ago, pretty thick across all the major newspapers, media outlets? How much are we losing here? And then I guess related is I feel like China isn't winning from this either. It both complains that the coverage of China is superficial, narrow, and biased. And the way it could rectify that is by really opening itself up for more media, not just requiring that, people tell positive stories about China, but really exploring, all aspects of it. So just, Ed, I'll start with you. Your thoughts about the state of journalism in China. There are still people there. Americans haven't fared so well, but there are folks from other, outlets, European, whatnot. But just your sense of where we stand right now.
I think that obviously there's been a huge curtailing of the variety of stories we've seen coming out of China because of the lack of personnel of reporters in China. Then and the lack of bandwidth, then people have to focus on these big stories that dominate the headlines. So, for example, when the spy balloon floats over the U.S. and U.S.-China tensions become very high, then the one or two reporters that news organization has remaining in Beijing or in Shanghai have to focus on reporting on the Chinese side of that story for weeks on end, rather than a news organization having a bureau of 8 to 10 people, which at times had at its height, it had like 8 to a dozen reporters one reporter could focus on the geopolitics, and the other one could focus on trade. Someone else could be out traveling to a province to report on some phenomenon that was happening out there. Like, you would have this like very textured look at China from the top down, from the elite levels of the government down to what was happening out in the provinces. And I feel that now you have a lot of reporters focusing on the big headline stories just because they're the only person there, and the editors are relying on them for that. And geopolitics then dominates the conversation, which I think is unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I think that, we should also mention that, the reporting environment has just really deteriorated over the years as well. I think when Ed was there early on, and in the early years that I was there as well, it was just so much easier and it felt safer to be able to speak with people. And now you really have to weigh the risks of quoting someone in a story. There's so many people who just won't be quoted in a story, or even the people who would go on background before just stop talking to you. And I think that has just really impacted the coverage. And as we all know, we've spent a lot of time in China. It's such a dynamic place. It's not only, the stories about the government, what the government is doing are very important, but there's so much else going on a day-to-day level there. And so to not be able to sort of capture that is, I think, a huge loss for China, and it's for our own understanding of China as well.
Yeah, and of course, journalists like think tanks are now using data visualizations, satellite imagery to tell some of these stories, which in the case of, human rights abuses in Xinjiang is still digging up and eliciting good stories. But I just feel like we're becoming much more blind to just a more holistic look at China.
I should say that also another effect that these government policies have had is there's been a great restriction on what Chinese reporters can do in China, both ones who are working for non-Western organizations, but also ones who used to work with the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Post or the AP or others. We all had these Chinese reporting partners that would work with us on stories, or they would do their own stories. And I felt when I was there towards the end of my time in China, we were actually moving to a space where a lot of them were writing their own stories, even though the Chinese government officially said, Chinese reporters can't have bylines in these foreign publications, but they were able to do it on certain topics without incurring the wrath of the Chinese government. But now, of course, that space has closed up. And then Chinese officials, I think, are looking a lot more at these Chinese reporters who work for foreign organizations as potential threats to the state. And I think there's greater risk of them being labeled spies or being judged as agents of a foreign power. So I think that we lose a lot of our understanding of China because there's been the silencing of these Chinese journalists' voices across the board.
We've got an election coming up in November. I don't know if you guys know that for president.
There's been rumors of that.
They have. It's confirmed, November 5th. Right. It's definitely on. I think because we've got a potential inflection moment, at least in leadership here, it's causing a lot of folks, myself included, to think about the broader trajectory and where do we go. And of course, the obvious answer is we don't know. But for both of you, just curious, as you think about the U.S.-China relationship, from whatever angle you want to think about it, what's the optimistic case you can make about where this could be in 5 years and how we get there, and what's the pessimistic case you can make? I mean, maybe start with you. Again, you almost 10 years on the ground in China. You were in Taiwan, which is another big complicating factor of the U.S.-China relationship. On the upside, where are we? How did we get there? What did we do right? And on the downside, where are we and what did we do wrong?
You're saying in 5 years
5
from
years.
now.
You can pick your time frame, but
You take this one.
Ed.
first.
Yeah, I took this one, but you were the one in Taiwan. Like you say,
I'll
it's an
take Taiwan.
understatement to say that's a complicating factor.
Well, I mean, I can say that on Taiwan, I think that anyone that says that they know what exactly is going to happen on Taiwan doesn't really know what they're talking about. I mean, just having been on the ground there and spent a lot of time speaking with Taiwanese government officials and Taiwanese people there, I think that it's clear that, we all have seen the sort of ramp up of rhetoric over the last few years, and also in addition to the ramp up of rhetoric, different policies changing as well. But this is such a chess match with so many different calculations on the U.S. side, on the China side, on Taiwan side, that it's really hard to say, what exactly is going to happen. So if, on the upside, I don't think it's controversial to say that no one wants to see war. But the potential for as everyone has been sort of talking about, kind of slow creep of, China squeezing Taiwan and how the U.S. would react. I mean, that would be very kind of dependent on how the U.S. reacts would be really dependent on who's in office then. What would happen if there was some sort of accident in the Taiwan Strait? This is all sort of comes down to, I think, quick decisions that are made by executives, and so it makes November very consequential when you're talking about what's going to be happening in that side of the world.
You might have just answered this question already by saying you don't think there's a date Xi Jinping has circled on his calendar for 2027. But having spent a couple of years living there, reporting, talking to people there, what is the thing you think those of us who live in D.C. are getting wrong or misunderstanding the most? Is it that we think there's some sort of fixed trajectory here that the Chinese are on, or is there some other element of how we think about Taiwan or Taiwan Strait or risks in the Taiwan Strait that you just think after being there for a few years isn't the case?
I think it's very easy for the nationalist voices to float up to the top. But even the nationalist voices, if you hear them in other contexts, they're not always going to be so pro-government in every single situation. And so, even if people, I do think that it is sort of a sort of knee-jerk reaction from most Chinese people, even many Chinese liberals that you speak with, to believe that Taiwan is a part of China. That's something that they've just been instilled with from, a very young age. But whether or not it's worth it to risk everything, the many middle-class lives that they've built over time just to take Taiwan, I don't know if everyone would necessarily support that, no matter how much propaganda there was to sort of kind of push that.
Let's hope Xi Jinping is listening to the people on that one. Ed, much more directly, because you're the diplomatic correspondent, you've 5 years, what's the optimistic case of where the bilateral relationship is, and what choices will have been made to get us there? And then on the downside, where could we be, and what are the choices we made or didn't make that will get us there?
I mean, I think one of the points that Amy makes is the contingency based on personal choices by individual leaders. And I think that's where everything hinges in some ways. That the optimistic case would be that you have these leaders in power in these two countries, as well as in the allied countries around them, that decide, we need to figure out some accommodation where our countries can work together, maybe work together on certain common causes, whether that's preventing things like famine or disease in parts of the world, or climate change, or preventing certain wars from breaking out, and continue to do trade. We can compete on trade, and we will draw certain lines in our military competition, which I think is the trickiest part of all this, and that we will do all this and not clash with each other, or when those clashes happen, they're minor and we can quickly manage them. I think that's at the same time, I think there will be unease in the relationship even then because of the ideological aspects of the competition. I do think ideology does play a role. I think because the U.S. Has, in a sense, a missionary component to its self-conception and to its conception as a leading democratic power in the world. And even a transactional president like Trump, within his administration, there is still this I think in a Trump administration, there would still be embedded somehow this idea. And so I think a party like the Communist Party, and it doesn't have to be C, it could be someone else at the top of the party, will see that as always a potential threat, I think, to the power of the party. And so there will be wariness. And then on this side, an American government will always be wary of another government that is very powerful like China, but expresses different values of governance from the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is now grappling with its own internal, turbulence over issues of authoritarianism and democracy. But in general, I still think it sees itself as a democratic power, and many people across administrations will see it that way. So I think that's always going to be this underlying tension. So I think the best case scenario.
Your upside is not very up in terms of what the relationship looks like.
Right, but it's not awful, because I think that many periods in U.S.-China history, there was a combination, ideological tension. I mean, even during reform and opening up, there was still an underlying sense of an ideological tension somewhere in there, because the U.S. felt that it could change China. And if there was no ideological tension, the I think American officials wouldn't have felt that somehow China's political system would change or needed to be changed. But I think a lot of American officials did feel that way. I know some people disagree with that, but I do think that many people starting from the 1990s onward felt that way. And
also, if you look at the 75 year of the formal relationship between the U.S. and China, I mean, we had crises and bad points all throughout this, right? So I think, 1996, Third Taiwan Straits crisis, 1999, bombing of the Belgrade embassy.
Right.
I mean, this has been a constant, to the optimistic side that we might be able to find a way to manage this. We have been managing this, and things on Taiwan have been far worse than they are now. Right? Go back to 1954, first Taiwan Straits crisis, 1958. So things have been a lot worse.
Yeah, the two armies were in direct conflict on the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s.
Right.
So, and in the Vietnam War, the two militaries were also in conflict, though not directly.
Again, a low baseline to draw, comparing us now to 50.
Right. So let's go to some of the downs. I mean, I did mention the ideological shadow that hangs over it. One thing I do think is that I don't see a strong evidence that China has a strong drive to export ideology to other countries or to change governance in other countries in a dramatic manner, the same way that the Soviets tried to do. I know some people disagree. Some people who've studied China very closely will disagree with me on that, but I want to see more evidence of that before I come to that conclusion. And so I think that in itself doesn't mean, at least sets a ceiling on how far ideological tensions might grow. But I do think that there are some structural issues with the relationship that don't depend on the contingency of leaders. One is the fact that I think that the U.S. wants to maintain military dominance, or at least a superior military force in the Asia-Pacific region, and China does not want that. I think China wants its military to be the superior force in the Asia-Pacific region. I think it wants not to be constrained by U.S. basing around the Pacific. It wants to be able to use the airspace and the waterways the way it wants to use it. And the U.S. and many other Asian countries don't want that. So I think that's an inherent
I was going to say,
tension.
would you agree that for a lot of countries in the region, they would also prefer that the U.S. maintain military primacy?
I think they want the U.S. to be there as a balancing force against this growing PLA force that we see. And I think we see, obviously, the close U.S. allies in the region definitely want that, and they've increased their military cooperation with the U.S. as we've seen in recent years. So I think countries like Vietnam do want great enough U.S. military presence in the region where China cannot pose a threat to Vietnam. As we know, the last war that China fought was with Vietnam in 1979. And so I think there are countries there who remember this history very sharply, and they want a counterbalancing force to China. But I do think that that's a structural problem in the relationship, and I don't see any easy resolution for that. And I think that if you were in China's place, of course you would, it's completely rational to want to be the superior military force in your own backyard. I mean, the U.S., look at the anxieties in the U.S. when we discovered what the Soviet military is planning to do in Cuba, for example, in the 1950s. And if there had been Soviet warships and spy planes near the coast of the U.S. constantly during the Cold War, how would we have reacted, or what would have been our anxieties towards that? I think that the Chinese feel that. And so I think that this is a point of conflict that would be very hard to reconcile. On the other hand, there's other structural things like the fact that we have closely intertwined economic systems. China is a big player in global trade, just as the U.S. is. We're huge trade partners. The trade has only grown in recent years, despite tariffs that Trump and Biden have kept on China. And we're also both nuclear powers. So it's hard to imagine two nuclear superpowers getting into a direct war with each other. Right now, the Biden administration is trying very hard not to have U.S. troops in direct conflict with Russians because I think of the nuclear shadow hanging over that conflict. So I think that there are other structural elements that will mitigate the potential for conflict.
We'll take that as an optimistic way to end the conversation. Ed, again, congratulations. A fantastic book, getting all the great reviews that it deserves. And Amy, thank you so much for coming in, joining us. Good to see you again. And I guess the one benefit that DC has gained from the reporting environment in China is that a lot of that crew is now back here in Washington, which makes life better for people like me. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jude.
Thanks, Jude.